So we are continuing to talk about McCloskey's views on rhetoric, economics as a form of rhetoric. And she says there are some good sides of rhetoric, which are we can write in a better way, better writing, better teaching, through using metaphors and other kinds of literary techniques, so to speak. It's a good way of teaching, and I would agree, actually. Better writing, again, you can use them literary things, methods, ways, whatever, which is, again, good for the reader in general. Better foreign relations, I mean with the other sciences, other scientific inquiries, people who are engaging in other sciences as well, especially within the social sciences in general. It allows us to do better science and better disposition, better way of thinking, better way of acting even, etc. So rhetoric should not be rejected in the name of science. It's not unscientific. On the contrary, economics is a rhetoric, is a form of rhetoric, and that is good, actually, according to her, because any science, social science, especially economics, should have some criticism of what she calls modern science, basically, but it is actually, in my opinion, positivism. So again, just because we reject positivism doesn't necessarily mean that we should also reject modern science or the idea that there is a truth to be understood or whose knowledge can be achieved, etc., which is very difficult, not as simple as the positivists would argue, but still there is a thing, I would say, called truth and therefore of science. So this is another idea. Closely associated with the postmodern thinking, especially these days, is the notion of pluralism, because pluralism is good, is deemed as good by everyone almost these days, by the mainstream economists, by the critiques of economics in general, by the practitioners of the heterodox thinking, etc. They all believe that we should have a pluralistic approach towards economics because there is not a single theory that could explain everything. So multiplicity of theories or approaches is needed or required in economics as well. Pluralism has some intrinsic value, does it? So maybe we should talk a little or more about the notion of pluralism, especially since the early 1990s. This is the period in which economists are involved in discussions of postmodernity and so forth. The notion of pluralism has begun to attract great attention, and usually it is associated with the critique of neoclassical economics. Especially McCloskey and Palover, I would say, argue usually that they are criticizing neoclassical economics. This is not my own position, but still they have some point in saying so. Anyway, that's another discussion. Why? Maybe in passing, I can say, again, the same thing, I would say. Just because we reject positivism, which is supposedly the official method of economics, doesn't necessarily imply or require a kind of postmodern approach. There's no need, in my own position, to reject that there is a thing called truth. That's another debate, of course. But my problem is that what is meant by pluralism is not always clear in this controversy, which actually increases confusion and uncertainty. There are different ways of defining pluralism. there's a plurality of the definitions of pluralism, so to speak. Maybe we should distinguish first between two terms. One is the plurality. It means basically multiplicity of theories or theoretical approaches, whatever. But pluralism is an ideological, so to speak, or at least prescriptive idea. You know, you should respect for pluralism. Thou shalt be pluralistic. You know, you have to embrace different methods, different ideas, different positions, different worldviews, etc., etc. So, but unfortunately, the notion of pluralism cannot maybe be defined in the clear and distinct way as what Descartes want to have, for example. For this reason, different forms of pluralism as a prescriptive methodology must be distinguished. Pluralism is taught to some interesting value, as I said, but this confusion creates its own complexities. How so? For example, this is one attempted definition of pluralism and plurality. And this definition was developed by two guys, Claudius, I don't know how to pronounce German thing, that particular letter, A, look like A, it's not A, actually there are two little points on it, so I have no idea how it is pronounced. Well, anyway, these people wrote a working paper, Pluralism in Economics, its critiques and their lessons, in that they have a classification. There are five different definitions of plurality according to them. One is theoretical plurality. There are more than one theory, so there should be, as a way of pluralistic thought. Epistemological plurality, criteria, it's about criteria for what counts as a good explanation. Purpose or pragmatic plurality, aims of inquiry, questions and problems considered worthy of inquiry. Some of them may not be that worthy. Methodological plurality, methods used for inquiry, and axiological plurality, it's about values underlying the inquiry. So there are some differences among them. You know, we can make distinctions among theories, how science is supposed to do, supposed to be done, purpose, what are our purposes, what methods should be used, and what are the values upon which we can build our theories or methods or whatever. And also there are critiques of these positions, like, according to same writers. One is the discipline is already pluralist, so there's no need for calling a kind of pluralistic approach as a general methodology or idea. Depends, as a response, we can say, or they can say, that it depends on what you mean when you say pluralist. Again, we are coming to the same question over and over. Openness to new ideas, but not to different methodologies. Well, neoclassical economics, as we say, is based upon three premises in general: methodological individualism, rationality, and equilibrium method. So they have no intention to change these premises or methodological tenets. Other than this, they are open, so to speak, to new ideas, but methods should be the same. Another argument against plurality or pluralism is that if there were need for pluralism, it would emerge on its own. You know, this is the idea of maybe a kind of invisible hand in science. You know, if there's such a need, market already provides with these, with something, with us, with some methods or ideas. So evidence points to the contrary, because of path dependencies in current institutions, the opinion of the scientific community, you know, a Kuhnian perspective, uneven citing practices among heterodox and mainstream scholars, it's really a big difference, and the lack of pluralism in university curricula. Of course, not every university is Hacettepe University Department of Economics, right? We can teach different classes. So we embrace a pluralistic approach, I would say, right? Yes, you're supposed to say right. Anyway, pluralism means anything goes and is thus unscientific. This is another argument against plurality. But they argue that these guys, pluralism does not mean anything goes, but it does imply a broadening of research standards. I'm not sure what this means. But there's an open question here, according to them, how to ensure quality. So there's a trade-off, it seems, between broadening research standards and the quality, right? If we include very different and diverse methods of inquiry and methods of validation, etc., we cannot ensure quality. And another argument is that we need a core paradigm in economics, which is mainstream or neoclassical economics, because that's what determines a mature science. The Kuhnian approach again says that a mature science is characterized by a single paradigm. So in economics, we have the most important paradigm, neoclassical one, in its different guises. So economics should be considered as a mature science, which is not true, of course, right? With each period, actually, the paradigm, the dominant paradigm at least, changes, it seems, depending on the crises, for example, etc. So against these, the writers say that in the light of fundamental epistemological uncertainty, we cannot rely on a single way of doing economics, or a single core, because it seems reality is more complex than could be understood by a single method of theory. And also another, I believe, most stupid criticism is that pluralism is left-wing ideology. And they say, while there are some people trying to exploit the pluralism movement for the sake of their political agendas, there is in general no evidence that this is a decisive element of pluralism. Well, this is stupid, actually, because these days, I would say, most enthusiastic followers of the notion of pluralism is actually mainstream people, or people who are close to kind of mainstream thinking, basically. By close to mainstream thinking, I would include, for example, new institutionalism and some forms of the evolutionary economics, and even the rhetorical approach in economics, especially Diedrich Markowski, can never be, in my mind, of course, a kind of oppositional representative of the pluralistic movement. They believe usually that even Austrians believe that they are against the current mainstream economics, and they do a kind of different paradigm, different theory based upon a different paradigm than that of the neoclassical theory. So again, there's a confusion in this, and usually the left-wing people, maybe they are open to the idea of pluralism, but some of them, especially Marxists, for example, reject the notion of pluralism in a strong way, I would say, because Marx himself says that what he's doing, he was doing for science, and other is the vulgar economics and so forth. So this is a stupid claim, I would say, stupid criticism, and no need to defend pluralism against this kind of criticism. I would say both the right wing and left wing or neutral people can defend a kind of plurality, the need for plurality in economics. That has to do with teaching economics, that has to do with understanding the reality, etc., etc. So another form of pluralism is called as model pluralism by some other guy, Walter Waite. A most recent paper, Model Pluralism, published in the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. And he distinguishes among different 4 kinds of pluralism. Actually on a scale between 0 and 4, there are different forms of pluralism according to its weakness or strength, basically. First one is model monism. There's only, or there should be only one general model. Instead of theories, actually, this approach takes into consideration the models. Models are important in some sciences, especially in economics, as we all know. So model monism rejects basically the need for plurality. There should be only one scientific model. And first form is weak, and the last form is the strongest form of model pluralism, according to this. The weak form says that there are many phenomena and scientists need different models to explain or predict these different phenomena. Weakly moderate model pluralism states that each phenomenon has many different aspects, and scientists need different models to explain or predict these different aspects of a single phenomenon. Even for the same phenomena, we may have, or we should have, maybe, a different model or method even. Moderate model pluralism, and is missing over there. There exists an aspect of X, an aspect X of a phenomenon Y, such that scientists need multiple models to explain or predict X. And the strongest form argues that for almost any aspect X of phenomenon Y, scientists require multiple models to achieve scientific goal Z. Well, again, it's really hard, it seems, to me at least, to distinguish among different forms of model pluralism. So there are no clear-cut demarcation lines, it seems, among these 4 forms of model pluralism. So such a lack of a demarcation line cannot distinguish among different forms of pluralism, basically. So this definition of model pluralism seems to have 2 problems. One is already mentioned, you cannot clearly distinguish among them. I cannot understand, for example, the difference between the weak form and the strongest form, basically. All alternatives seem to lie in a continuum rather than as different stages or forms of model pluralism. The other is that there's a weakness of this argument, I believe, which is the limited scope of the argument. What I mean by this is simply that instead of models, we should be able to talk about theories and methods, right? Only models. Only a form of plurality with respect to models may not be, and I believe is not, enough to understand the complexity of phenomenon, etc., etc. This is another thing. Yet, we can talk about another classification. This classification is a classification that I prefer most because I devised it naturally. One is the idea that pluralism of truths, this is the Feyerabendin, if you will. Idea that we already mentioned, traditions are neither good nor bad, they simply are. It's not possible to compare among different traditions. Each tradition is good in its own rights, etc., etc. So mainly a postmodern position. Pluralism basically means that there may be more than one truth, and no truth is more important or better than others. That is to say, everything depends on the narrative. Everything depends on the text. Remember the hermeneutical position? Societies is like text, so you should be able to make interpretations in order to understand the meaning or extract the meaning of the text. Likewise, science is about talking narratives or devising some narratives to understand phenomena in question. So every narrative is naturally as good as the other one. And also a disturbing implication of this position is that it is not possible to distinguish between belief and knowledge. So in the first place, they reject this difference. According to Feyerabend, again, for example, there's no difference between science and religion, for example. Both are different ways of producing knowledge, right, basically. So scientific knowledge and the religious knowledge cannot be compared with each other, and they are as good as the other, etc. So this is a little disturbing, not in terms of the distinction between knowledge and religion, but in terms of belief and every kind of belief I'm talking about here. And the notion of knowledge, even Plato himself would reject this, right? So according to him, what we call knowledge or episteme is nothing but the justified true belief. Sure, we have to have a belief, it must be true, and also it should be justified by some evidence, so to speak. So another form is that pluralism of methods. So this is the idea that anything goes by Feyerabend again. In order for science to reach the truth, a multiplicity of methods are necessary. That's the rejection of the unity of methods. This can be distinguished from the first one. You know, in the first, we talked about truth itself. There's no such thing as the truth for a single phenomena, for example. There may be multiplicity of truths, but here we talk about the multiplicity of methods. It's an epistemological position. So any method, any useful method can be used to understand the phenomena in question. So there should be no unity of methods that should be adopted by all the scientists working on this phenomena. That is, anything goes because anything has gone in the history of science. It's an empirical claim, actually. For scientific truths have been reached through the rejection of the received wisdoms, so to speak, and methods. So we should always be open to new ideas and methods. Yet another form of pluralism, which I would prefer actually most, pluralism of presentations. You know, we can use what Marx says in this regard. He says something like this: of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. So if this is the case, one naturally asks when we talk about, for example, Das Kapital itself, is the dialectical method, for example, a kind of presentation? Which some people say so, or it's a matter of inquiry, which again, by other people, including Marx himself in Grundrisse, says so. So it creates a bit of confusion, but this distinction between presentation and the inquiry can be distinguished between, I guess, in my belief, at least. So a kind of pluralistic approach in presenting scientific thoughts and argument could be helpful, especially for the audiences, you know, attendees of the conferences, students, etc., etc. Even if there may be a number of ways to present the same idea, some of them are better than the others in terms of precision, understanding, beauty, elegance, etc. For example, there are some interesting and amusing ways of presentation. One is the method that is already talked, dialectics in Marx. According to Gareth Stedman Jones, for example, Marx uses the method of dialectics not as a method of inquiry, but as a method of presentation. It's nothing but an ornament, so to speak, of the book. You know, it makes us understand the notions in an easier way, basically, which, I don't know, he may have some point about this. Second is another method from theater, actually. Bertolt Brecht is a famous writer of theater, and he develops this idea of estrangement effect. This is very interesting. In his epic theater, later he called it dialectical theater, its basic objective is to shake the audience or shock it through using something that is awkward or not expected, unexpected, so that to make the audience think about what's going on here. So it's a matter of creating some consciousness in the audience, basically. It can be used in the cinema as well. There are some interesting examples for this. This may be used as a method of teaching at the same time, maybe, I don't know. There's another one, storytelling technique, especially used in the cultural studies. They are used extensively in other social sciences, not in economics though. And one is the specifically postmodern argument or method that is called bricolage, French word. Again, so it's a creation of the narration of a story based on constructing or creating from a diverse range of available things. You know, you can see that especially in paintings, right? So many painters use this technique, using some diverse and different objects or figures or techniques within the same paintings, etc. So it's a kind of like the vision that is produced by kaleidos, right? Kaleidoscope. You know, each time you turn the thing, you can see a different thing. So this is an interesting and also amusing way of, I believe, presenting your own ideas, maybe, you know, continuously changing your position or vantage point so that people, the audience or the students, can understand the phenomenon in its whole complexity, maybe. So that's another thing. And also, this one is particularly interesting, was developed by Stephen Ziliak. He's a friend of Deidre McCloskey, actually, you know, and follows her in her steps towards postmodern thinking. Again, we have only 10 minutes. So he says, he tries to develop some haiku. Haiku is the Japanese form of poetry. You know, it follows 5, 7, and 5 syllables. One example given by Ziliak himself is invisible hand, mother of inflated hope, mistress of despair. That's a good criticism of the notion of invisible hand that is used by liberal ideas, for example, but it's very condensed form, right? Hard to understand. And also, there may be another method of presenting things. You know, this is an example of WabiSabi economics. There's no such thing, actually, but, you know, as an idea, we can use this as a way of presentation, maybe, on my ideas. I can use it. It's about this WabiSabi is the traditional Japanese aesthetics. Is a worldview centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection. You know, that's the difference between Platonic and WabiSabi ideas. You know, in Platonic vision, we try to, or the art tries to seek out the most perfect form, right? You know, this other picture was the pottery produced industrially, actually, interesting, by Josiah Wedgwood. This guy was also the grandfather of Charles Darwin's. So he was, maybe you have seen in your economic history classes, he was the one who develops these potteries as a form of art even. So whenever the Western world tries to seek out the most perfected ones, these Japanese guys who believe in WabiSabi approach tries to find beauty within imperfections and changing, etc., etc. So our formal models of general equilibrium, for example, are in that sense Platonic, even Pythagorean orientation they have, and they are beautiful from a mathematical or even an aesthetic sense, but maybe it is their basic problem, right? Instead of trying to reach out some kind of perfection, we can see the imperfections, frictions of the reality itself. In that sense, for example, Keynesian economics is a better way of seeing the world and also presenting the world in its own imperfections and frictions, etc., etc. So there may be different methods that could be devised to present your ideas in different ways. Some of them may be better than the others, as I said. And also, the last but not the least is that pluralism of values. So there are several values, they're incommensurable. So there's no such thing as value monism, I'm sorry. So it's a theory in metaethics. And this guy, John Gray, has an interesting book about the two phases of liberalism. It's about liberalism, naturally. And he advances a kind of pluralistic values. But the problematic aspect of this idea is that there's no way of comparing among different values about the same issue, for example. So if this is the case, we cannot solve this problem of incommensurability again. But we know that economics is based upon some values, inevitably. So this is a problem we have to deal with. So what I'm saying is that, as a conclusion, I hope I can finish it in 5 minutes. The rhetoric of pluralism in economics cannot distinguish among these forms of pluralism. You know, they usually talk about pluralism, but they don't state, they don't explain clearly what they mean. You know, it could be a kind of pluralism of values, pluralism of theories, this and that. So here maybe method and presentation pluralism seems most promising in progressing economic thinking, maybe. But the last one is problematic, as I say, and the first one creates problems for the possibility of science itself. If this is the case, if there are more than one truths, science is not possible at all, I would say. With respect to neoclassical economics, I can say that, you know, there are some interesting properties of neoclassical economics these days in the last 20 years or so. One is that neoclassicists usually, especially after the 90s, come to claim that they can include different forms of thinking and methods and even ideas into the main body of neoclassical theory. You know, there are some examples for this, the idea of new institutionalism developed by Douglas North, basically, and also most recently Daron Acemoglu and friends and so forth. They never question the rationality and individualistic approach, but still they claim that they are institutionalist as against the Weblenian type of traditional institutionalism, maybe. And another thing is these days models are usually deals with empirical questions. You know, there's only one more general model, which a kind of monistic model pluralism, model monism, I would say, I'm sorry. But still, basic problems are about the empirical values of some coefficients, etc., etc. And the third aspect of the neoclassical economics is the famous idea of social science imperialism. We try to explain everything in society and even in nature with some ideas of rationality and individualism, which is, again, we have already talked about. Therefore, neoclassical economics seems to be successful in presenting itself as a kind of pluralistic approach, which is very interesting because some 30 years ago, for example, this was not the case. Neoclassical economics tried to defend itself against some forms of pluralistic criticisms from different angles, institutionalists, Marxists, heterodox, Austrians maybe, etc., etc. But these days they claim that they can embrace any kind of criticisms into its main body. So this is a way of Lakatoshian sense. In the Lakatoshian sense, we can say that is a kind of immunizing stratagems. So through these kinds of attempts, they have been able to domesticate, so to speak, these kinds of criticism in a way that the theory is finally almost invincible. I think that's enough for today, so that's why we should stop here.